The night was quiet, but inside a small Indiana house, a young boy lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the sound of bills being shuffled at the kitchen table. Every scrape of paper felt like a reminder that security was fragile, that comfort could disappear overnight. This was long before Papa John's became a global name. Long before millions recognized the red logo and the words "better ingredients." Better pizza. Back then, there was only a boy named John Schnatter, growing up with a constant sense that nothing in life was guaranteed. John was born in 1961 in Jeffersonville, Indiana, a modest town where dreams often felt bigger than the opportunities available. His family wasn't destitute, but they lived close enough to the edge that any small misstep could turn their world upside down. His father owned a tavern, a place filled with smoke, loud laughter, and the smell of cheap beer. To outsiders, it looked like a stable business. But to John, it felt like a ticking clock. He watched his parents work endless hours, saw the exhaustion on their faces, and slowly understood that effort didn't always equal reward. As a child, John learned what responsibility felt like far too early. While other kids played carefree games, he helped clean tables, wipe counters, and run errands for the family business. He saw how quickly money came in and how even faster it disappeared. Some nights, he would overhear arguments about expenses, about repairs, about whether the business could survive another slow month. Those moments planted something deep inside him, a fear mixed with a fierce determination. He didn't want to grow up wondering if tomorrow would be harder than today. He wanted to build a life where he was in control. School wasn't an escape for him. John wasn't the star student or the popular kid. He was often overlooked, sometimes underestimated. Teachers saw him as average, and his classmates saw him as unremarkable. But inside his mind, a quiet obsession was forming. He didn't dream of fame or applause. He dreamed of control, control over his future, control over his finances, control over the fear he had watched rule his parents' lives. Food became his strange refuge. Not eating it, but understanding it. He watched customers react differently to good food versus bad food. He noticed how quality could change moods, how people returned to places where they felt satisfied and respected. While others saw pizza as just cheap fast food, John saw something more. He saw consistency, repeat customers, and simplicity. Pizza was one of the few foods that brought families together, that turned strangers into regulars. Somewhere in his teenage years, an idea began to quietly take shape, though he didn't yet have the courage to name it. College was supposed to be his way out, his path to stability. John enrolled at Ball State University, hoping a degree would give him the secure future he craved. But reality hit hard. Tuition was expensive, and the cost of living just kept adding up. To make matters worse, his family's business was struggling more than ever. When his father faced the kind of financial trouble that threatens to take everything away, John made a decision that would define his entire life. He sold his most prized possession, a 1971 Camaro Z28, a car he loved more than anything. He got just $2,800 for it, and every single dollar went straight into saving his father's tavern. Handing over the keys felt like handing over a piece of himself. That car wasn't just metal and wheels, it was freedom. It was pride. It was proof that he could own something nice through his own hard work. And just like that, it was gone. That night, John sat alone, staring at the empty driveway, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and a powerful new resolve. He promised himself that if he ever got another chance, he would never again be forced to sacrifice his dreams just to survive. To earn extra money, John took a job at a local pizza place. It was nothing glamorous. The floors were greasy, the hours were long, and the pay was low. But to John, it was a classroom. He paid attention to everything: the texture of the dough, the flavor of the sauce, the temperature of the oven, and every single customer complaint. He noticed how cutting corners always showed up on the plate. Cheap ingredients meant disappointed customers, and disappointed customers never came back. Late at night, long after closing, John would stand alone in the empty kitchen, experimenting. He'd add a little more tomato to the sauce, try different kinds of cheese, and test countless dough recipes. These moments weren't driven by passion alone, but by obsession. He believed that if pizza could be done better, people would notice. And if people noticed, they would return. And if they returned, security would follow. Still, doubt followed him everywhere. Who was he to think he could build something bigger? He had no investors, no famous mentors, no safety net. All he had was a relentless inner voice whispering that mediocrity was a slow death. Every shift he worked at the pizza shop only strengthened his belief that quality mattered more than speed, more than price, and more than convenience. By the time John graduated from college, his mind was made up. Against all advice, against all logic, and against all fear, he decided to start his own pizza business. He borrowed money. He convinced himself that taking a huge risk was better than living with regret. In 1984, at just 23 years old, John Schnatter knocked down a wall and opened a tiny pizza restaurant in what used to be a broom closet at the back of his father's tavern. The space was cramped, hot, and barely functional. There was no fancy equipment, no brand recognition, and no guarantee that anyone would even care. On opening night, John stood behind the counter, sweating, nervous, but filled with hope. Each pizza he handed over felt like a test of his entire life's belief system. He told himself over and over that if people could just taste the difference, everything would change. But as the first few days passed, reality hit harder than expected. Sales were painfully slow. Costs were high. The equipment kept breaking down. Mistakes piled up one after another. John found himself working 18-hour days, sometimes sleeping on the floor of the tavern, waking up with flour in his hair and a deep-seated fear in his chest. The dream he had built so carefully in his mind now stood on the very edge of collapse. And as the bills stacked up and pure exhaustion set in, John realized something terrifying. This wasn't the end of the struggle. This was only the beginning. Success did not come quietly, it did not come quickly, and it certainly did not come kindly. For John Schnatter, the dream that had once felt so close was now slipping further away with every passing month. The tiny pizza business he had clawed into existence wasn't growing the way he imagined. It was surviving, barely, and survival, when wrapped in debt and pressure, can feel more brutal than failure itself. Every morning, John unlocked the door of his small store with a knot in his stomach. The smell of dough and sauce no longer felt comforting. It felt heavy, like responsibility, like fear. Bills were stacked higher than the pizza boxes. Rent was due. Suppliers wanted payment. Employees expected their wages. And the bank? The bank never stopped calling. He had no safety net, no wealthy backer, no powerful mentor. He just had a belief that better pizza could actually matter in a world that was becoming obsessed with speed and shortcuts. But belief doesn't pay interest on a loan. The first cracks began to show with expansion. John thought opening one more store would change everything. One more location meant more customers, more revenue, more stability. Instead, it meant more rent, more equipment, and so much more risk. The second store struggled from day one. Foot traffic was low. Advertising cost more than he expected. A few bad weeks turned into a few bad months. At night, John would sit alone in his car after closing, just staring at the steering wheel, replaying every single decision he had made. Was the dough too expensive? Were the ingredients too good? Was he stupid for refusing to cut corners like everyone else? The competitors didn't help. National chains were everywhere. They sold pizza cheaper, faster. They used frozen dough, artificial flavors, and all the shortcuts John refused to touch. Customers didn't always understand the difference. Some just didn't care. You charge too much, they say. Pizza is pizza. Why should I wait longer when I can get it cheaper down the street? Each comment felt like a small, painful cut. Then came the betrayals. An early business partner, someone John trusted, started questioning his decisions openly. Meetings turned tense. Arguments replaced strategy sessions. The partner wanted to lower the quality to raise the profit margins. John flat out refused. The disagreement grew toxic, and eventually, the partnership collapsed, leaving John with legal fees, emotional exhaustion, and even more financial strain. He had built something with his own two hands, and now he was watching it bleed out. The humiliation reached a new level when vendors began refusing him credit. Flour deliveries were delayed. Cheese suppliers demanded cash up front. One afternoon, a delivery truck just never arrived. John stood in the kitchen, staring at empty shelves, realizing he couldn't fulfill orders. He had to send his employees home early that night. Alone in the store, he cleaned counters that didn't need cleaning. He wiped the same surface again and again, as if scrubbing harder could somehow erase the fear building inside him. He thought about walking away, about selling what little he had left, about admitting defeat. But pride and desperation are a dangerous combination. The disaster came without warning. A regional economic downturn hit the area hard. Offices closed. Families cut back on spending. Late-night orders slowed to a trickle. The weekend rushes shrank. Revenue dropped sharply, but the expenses stayed the same. The math simply stopped working. One morning, John received a letter from the bank. He already knew what it said before he even opened it. Loan payments were overdue. His credit was frozen. If things didn't change fast, foreclosure was inevitable. That night he didn't go home. He slept on the floor of the store, using a folded jacket as a pillow. The hum of the refrigerator echoed through the dark, empty room. He stared at the ceiling, thinking about the car he had sold, the years he had sacrificed, the promises he had made to himself. Was this it? Days later, the breaking point arrived, a lawsuit. It was small, but it was devastating. A dispute over a lease agreement, legal costs he couldn't afford, stress he couldn't escape. For the first time, John felt something close to pure panic. His chest tightened, his thoughts raced. The future blurred into a single terrifying possibility, total collapse. He stopped answering some calls. He started avoiding his friends. He skipped family gatherings. Shame wrapped around him like a second skin. Everyone had believed in him once. What would they think now? One evening, after closing early due to slow sales, John sat at a small table, staring at a cold slice of pizza. He took a bite and froze. It didn't taste right. Not bad, just off. That moment haunted him. If even his own product wasn't perfect anymore, then what was the point of all this? That night, something shifted inside him. It wasn't hope. It wasn't optimism. It was something darker, a realization. He had been fighting the wrong battle. John realized he could never win by playing defense. Competing on price would destroy him. Cutting the quality would erase the one thing that made his brand matter in the first place. Expansion without a clear identity was killing him. So he made a decision that terrified everyone around him. He stopped trying to be bigger. Instead, he decided to be louder, focused on one single idea: better ingredients. Better pizza. This wasn't just a slogan. It was a line in the sand. He doubled down when he should have pulled back. He sourced even better tomatoes, fresher cheese, higher quality flour. He simplified the menu, removing items that didn't meet his obsessive standards. He focused relentlessly on consistency. Financially, it made no sense. His costs went up. His margins shrank. Advisors warned him he was accelerating straight toward bankruptcy. One consultant told him directly, "This will finish you." John listened. Then he ignored them all. Because he had reached the point where failure felt inevitable anyway. And when you believe you have nothing left to lose, fear loses its power. The real risk came next. John made a shocking move. He decided to personally guarantee new loans using everything he had left. Not the business, not projections, himself, his future, his reputation. If this failed, there would be no second chance. At the same time, he poured his energy into the customer experience. Late-night deliveries. Personal apology calls for mistakes. Free pizzas sent out without even being asked. He wanted his customers to feel something, trust, care, a real difference. Slowly, quietly, something began to change. A few customers noticed. They talked. Word spread not through ads but through honesty. One person told another, "This pizza actually tastes better." Another said, "They really care." Sales stabilized. They didn't surge, but they stabilized. It wasn't victory. But it wasn't death either. Yet just as John allowed himself a brief moment of relief, a new threat emerged. The larger competitors noticed the noise he was making. They mocked the idea of better ingredients. They launched their own copycat messaging. They undercut his prices. They used their size as a weapon. John stood at the edge again. Exhausted, broke, cornered. On the night Papa John's finally broke through, John Schnatter didn't pop champagne. He sat alone in his car, parked across the street from one of his stores. He just watched. The lights inside cast a warm glow as his employees moved with a rhythm he'd only ever dreamed of. Dough spinning in the air. Ovens humming. Phones ringing off the hook. Customers lining up. What he felt wasn't joy. It was a profound sense of disbelief. For the first time since he sold his beloved Camaro to start this crazy venture, the constant, gripping fear he lived with finally loosened its hold, just a little. The company was still fragile, still teetering on a knife's edge, but it was no longer invisible. Papa John's had survived long enough to be noticed. This turning point wasn't luck. It was born from a pure, relentless obsession. John had always believed the entire pizza industry was quietly broken. The big chains worshipped speed and price, cutting corners where customers couldn't see. Frozen dough, cheap cheese, tomato paste, stretched thin with sugar and water. The average person didn't know they were settling for less. They just thought this is what pizza was supposed to taste like. John refused to accept that. He made a decision that any business advisor would have called career suicide. Papa John's would be slower, more expensive to run, and brutally honest about its ingredients. Better ingredients. Better pizza. That wasn't just a marketing slogan. It was a direct challenge to the entire industry. And this decision nearly destroyed him. Using fresh dough meant more labor and more waste. High-quality cheese squeezed his margins until they screamed. Sourcing vine-ripened tomatoes created logistical nightmares. His competitors laughed at him. Franchise consultants told him he was building a business that could never scale. Investors showed him the door. Banks hesitated to lend him money. For months, growth didn't just slow down, it completely stalled. John watched his rivals open new stores, plaster their ads everywhere, and dominate the airwaves. That old, familiar anxiety crept back in, whispering in his ear that he'd chosen pride over survival. But then, something unexpected happened. Customers started to notice. Not all at once, and not with a big bang, but slowly, steadily. One by one, people came back. They brought their friends. They started talking, comparing notes. Sales didn't just spike. They deepened. The average amount people spent per order went up. Customer complaints went down. Real loyalty began to form. Papa John's wasn't just another pizza place anymore. It was becoming a statement. People stopped saying, "Let's get pizza." They started saying, "Let's get Papa John's." That subtle difference changed everything. Suddenly, franchise owners were calling him, instead of the other way around. The same investors who had ignored him were now asking for meetings. But John remained cautious, almost paranoid. He knew how quickly hope could curdle into collapse. He believed expansion was the most dangerous phase for any business. It wasn't growth itself that killed companies, it was growth without discipline. So he expanded slowly, deliberately. He chose partners who were willing to accept his strict quality controls and his refusal to take shortcuts. Some walked away, but the ones who stayed became fiercely loyal. Of course, success always attracts enemies. As Papa John's footprint grew, the giants of the industry began to respond. Advertising wars erupted. Competitors openly mocked his ingredient claims, calling them exaggerated, elitist, and even deceptive. Then came the lawsuits. Regulatory agencies started scrutinizing his every move. Every single word and every single ad was challenged. John found himself stuck in depositions, reading his own slogans back to lawyers who were trying to prove he was a liar. The pressure was absolutely relentless. Any misstep, any slip-up, could shatter the trust he had spent years building. Internally, the stress was taking its toll. John became more intense, more demanding, and more controlling. His employees noticed his temper grew shorter. He pushed his teams harder than ever, slept less, and trusted fewer people around him. Growth brought in revenue, but it also magnified every single flaw in the system. Operations were strained. Mistakes started happening more frequently. A single bad franchise could damage the entire brand overnight. John took it personally. He would review customer complaints himself, often calling customers directly to apologize, offer a refund, and do whatever it took to make it right. He truly believed that one disappointed customer could erase the goodwill of 100 happy ones. The real breakthrough moment didn't come from a press release or an award. It came in the form of cold, hard numbers that finally silenced the critics. The economics of each Papa John's store were outperforming the industry average. The profitability for his franchise owners was exceeding all expectations. His store-level profit margins held strong, even with the higher cost of his premium ingredients. Wall Street analysts began to take notice. The media followed. The story shifted from idealistic founder with a dream to serious contender in the pizza wars. Then came the decision that terrified him more than any lawsuit or competitor: going public. Taking Papa John's to the stock market meant giving up absolute control. It meant dealing with quarterly earnings reports, shareholder pressure, and analysts dissecting his every decision. For a man who had built his entire identity on independence and a deep-seated fear of failure, it felt like stepping onto incredibly thin ice. But John also understood something critical. To compete on a global stage, to defend against the giants, and to secure the company's future beyond his own personal strength, Papa John's needed capital and credibility. Staying private would eventually become a weakness. The IPO was a huge success on paper. But for John, it was a psychological shock. Overnight, he went from a scrappy founder to a public company's CEO. His words could now move the stock market. His mistakes echoed louder than ever before. The daily stock price became a public judgment of his worth. Fame followed, but it wasn't the kind he had imagined. Interviews focused less on the pizza and more on his personality. The media painted him as eccentric, obsessive, and difficult. He would smile for the cameras, but off camera, he felt completely exposed. International expansion accelerated. Papa John's entered new countries, new cultures, with new expectations. Recipes had to be adapted without betraying the core promise of the brand. Supply chains now stretched across oceans. Mistakes were inevitable. In some markets, the brand struggled to find its footing. In others, it exploded with popularity. Each success felt hard-earned. Each failure felt deeply personal. John was constantly traveling, inspecting stores, meeting with franchisees, and arguing about the quality of cheese in boardrooms thousands of miles from the Broom closet where it all began. Recognition started pouring in. The company topped rankings and won awards. Headlines declared Papa John's a legitimate rival to the industry's biggest players. For a brief moment, the dream finally aligned with reality. John stood on stages, telling the story of the Camaro, the Broom closet, and the risky bet that paid off. Audiences applauded, employees cheered. His franchisees felt a deep sense of pride. The company grew to thousands of locations worldwide. The fear that had once defined him transformed into something else, not quite confidence, but a quiet sense of validation. The true emotional victory, however, came quietly, the way all real victories do. One afternoon, long after the media spotlight had moved on, John visited his father's grave. He stood there alone, in the silence. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just thought about the man who had lost his job, about the kid who was sent home from school, about the Camaro that now only existed as a story. Papa John's was no longer just about survival, it was proof. Proof that a relentless obsession could outlast doubt. Proof that quality could scale. And proof that a boy who once felt disposable could build something the world couldn't ignore. But as he walked away, his phone already buzzing with messages from executives and analysts, John didn't feel like the journey was over. By the time Papa John's was a household name, John Schnatter was no longer the desperate young man sweeping floors at midnight, just trying to survive. He was carrying something much heavier than the fear of failure. He was carrying the weight of influence. He had thousands of employees and franchise owners who had invested their entire life savings. Families depended on the reputation of his brand. With scale came responsibility, and with that came a pressure that never, ever turned off. As he got older, John started talking less about growth charts and more about purpose. He believed businesses don't exist in a vacuum. Every single store changes the community around it. He quietly funded education programs for his employees and supported local charities, preferring to stay anonymous rather than chase applause. When disaster struck, Papa John's trucks would show up with food long before the news cameras did. To John, this wasn't charity. It was repayment. He felt that success created a debt to society that could never be fully paid, only honored. But while the company was maturing, something inside John started to harden. Years of fighting competitors, defending quality, and protecting the brand had turned him into someone who was constantly on guard. He trusted fewer people. He spoke more bluntly. He believed that honesty, even when it was uncomfortable, was always better than diplomacy. In the early days, that directness fueled speed and clarity, but at the top, it became dangerous. The world around him had changed. Words no longer stayed in the room where they were spoken. Context didn't travel with quotes. A single sentence could escape into the public and be twisted beyond recognition. The breaking point came suddenly, but the conditions had been building for years. A private conversation surfaced. Words spoken casually, without any intent to cause harm, were pulled into the light and judged without mercy. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Social media erupted in outrage. News outlets fanned the flames. Sponsors pulled their support. Franchise owners, terrified, flooded corporate offices with calls. Employees worried about boycotts and losing their jobs. The brand that was built on trust was suddenly standing on shaky ground. John apologized. He tried to explain the context. He admitted he was wrong. But none of it mattered. In moments like these, public opinion doesn't wait for nuance. The company's board moved quickly, choosing survival over loyalty. Emergency meetings were held. Lawyers advised them to create distance. And while executives debated the company's future, he wasn't even in the room. The founder, who was once the heart of the company, was now seen as a liability. When John was forced out of Papa John's, it wasn't a graceful exit. It was abrupt and cold. One day, he was the face of the brand. The next, he was completely erased. His image was pulled from advertising, his name removed from press releases, and his vision cut from the future roadmap. The company that bore his name, the company he built from a broom closet, continued on without him. For John, the loss wasn't about money, it was existential. He hadn't just lost a job. He had lost the very thing that had defined his identity for over 30 years. The silence that followed was crushing. He retreated from public view. The phone stopped ringing. The media that once celebrated him now dissected his every flaw. He had to watch from a distance as Papa John's rebranded, changed its leadership, and publicly distanced itself from its own founder. Seeing his name on a company that no longer wanted him was a kind of pain he had never known. His health started to decline. The stress took a massive toll. The sleepless nights returned, but this time, there was no problem he could solve with just hard work. He wrestled with regret, replaying conversations and decisions over and over in his mind. He started to question if his intensity had crossed the line into arrogance, whether his refusal to soften his approach had cost him everything. For a man who had always believed that control was the key to survival, losing all control was unbearable. And yet time did what conflict couldn't, it slowed him down. Removed from the day-to-day grind, John was forced to reflect. He began to see his own story from the outside, without the ego and the urgency. He realized that Papa John's surviving without him wasn't a betrayal of his legacy, it was proof of it. The systems he built, the standards he enforced, the culture he created, they had all outgrown their creator. That realization hurt, but it also started to heal him. He began to understand that true success isn't about being needed forever. It's about building something strong enough to continue without you. Gradually, John re-engaged with the world, but this time on his own terms. He invested in new ventures, not to dominate a market, but out of curiosity. He started meeting with young founders privately, sharing the hard-won lessons he had learned. He would warn them that success magnifies your flaws much faster than it rewards your strengths. He told them that ego grows quietly, often disguised as confidence. He explained that building a brand is easy, but becoming worthy of it is the hard part. He spoke openly about his failure, about how public mistakes leave scars that never fully fade. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was asking for honesty. His message was no longer about pizza. It was about humility. It was about knowing when to listen, and understanding that leadership isn't just about having a vision. It's also about having restraint. Meanwhile, Papa John's continued to evolve. Under new leadership, the brand focused on repairing trust, modernizing its operations, and reconnecting with customers. It expanded into new markets, experimented with new products, and adapted to a changing world. The company grew quieter, steadier, and less dependent on a single personality. And in doing so, it secured its future. Today, Papa John's has thousands of stores all over the globe. Millions of people buy their pizza without ever knowing the full story of the man behind it. And maybe, just maybe, that's how it was meant to be. Brands that last eventually become larger than their founders. They become a part of our culture, our memories, our daily routines. John Schnatter's legacy is complex, human, and unfinished. He isn't a symbol of perfect success, nor is he just a cautionary tale. He's a reminder that ambition can build empires, but only self-awareness can sustain them. That obsession can lead to excellence, but unchecked obsession can lead to isolation. That the very same traits that lift you up can also be the ones that bring you down if you don't keep them in check. For anyone watching this who feels small or insignificant at the start of their own journey, remember this. John Schnatter began with nothing but rejection and a powerful belief that quality mattered. He faced humiliation, risked everything he had, and built one of the most recognizable brands in the world. He also made mistakes, paid a very public price, and learned lessons that few people are ever prepared for. Your path will not be straight, your victories will not always be clean, and your failures will probably not be private. But if you can remain honest with yourself, if you continue to learn even when it hurts, if you understand that real growth requires humility just as much as it requires confidence, then your story too can matter. Because legacy is not about never falling. It's about what remains standing long after you do. And sometimes, the most powerful success story isn't about how high you rise, but how clearly you're able to see when everything finally becomes quiet. Thanks for watching.